Now, I wonder if someone who wants to resist the entailment could, I'll just run this by you, see what you
Mhm.
think, could invoke theological fatalism to draw a distinction between a Diana case, a goddess case, and then a God situation
Mhm.
involving classical theism.
Once you see how I think what is the best way to respond to manipulation, it'll turn out that God setting things up to happen as He wants them to happen isn't going to be any more of a threat to freedom and responsibility than ordinary, natural determinism. Does it really increase the cost of compatibilism? They have to say that some, manipulated agents are morally responsible.
Hey, before jumping into the video, I want to give you a free guide, 5 powerful arguments for God's existence. Goes over 5 important arguments for the existence of God and gives you just a concise summary of the argument itself, how the premises are supported, and then additionally some objections to the argument, including some potential replies. So go get that now at thephilosophicalchristian.com/5, the number 5 arguments. Welcome to the Coffee with Philosophers podcast. My name is Christopher Cluse, and I'm here with Dr. Taylor Sear, and he's assistant professor of philosophy at Samford University. His main interests in research are metaphysics and ethics, and specifically, he focuses on free will and moral responsibility. But he also has interests in things like death, immortality, time travel, and personal identity as well. He's written a number of books, and specifically, he has one forthcoming that is based on, if I'm not mistaken, the Free Will Show.
Hmm. That's right.
So definitely watch for that. How free are we? And that's conversations from his Free Will Show podcast. So I definitely recommend checking that out. He has a edited, or actually just a book itself with co-edited with Andrew Law and Neil Tognazzini on freedom, responsibility, and value, essays in honor of John Martin Fisher. And we were just talking prior to coming on about the connection between his advisor, John Martin Fisher, and then my mentor, Anthony Bruckner. They were really good friends, co-wrote papers, and went way back, and we're had a lot of fun together too. And then he's written a number of articles. I won't mention all of them, but just a few is forthcoming in Philosophical Issues is Why History Matters for Moral Responsibility. And then also he just came out with in Faith and Philosophy, Dependence and the Freedom to Do Otherwise. And then lastly, I'll mention some of his book chapters. So he has one forthcoming in the T&T Clark Handbook of Election called Election and Human Agency, Leah Vincent. And then also today, what we're going to talk about is his article, Natural Compatibilists Should Be Theological Compatibilists. And that has been published 2002 in the volume called Theological Determinism. And that's by Cambridge University Press. So if you're interested in this talk and what the things that we talk about, definitely go grab that book and then check out his chapter. And then there's other great chapters as well. So as you may know, I like to start things out with a 5 books question. So the question is, what 5 books would you bring to a deserted island if you were going to be stuck there by yourself for 10 years?
So you gave me this question ahead of time. I had plenty of time to think, and I still have not come to my decisive list. So maybe I'll mention some things that I'm considering as being in my 5 books I'd bring. Probably I'd bring Augustine's Confessions, no matter what the other 4 books turned out to be. That's among my favorite books, and every time that I read it, I see something new philosophically or theologically. There's always I appreciate something different about it than I had before. So that's one that I could see myself, rereading over more than 10 years, whether I'm on an island or not. So that's definitely one of them. Some of my other favorite philosophy books, I mean, it would be hard not to bring, Republic or Nicomachean Ethics or, classics that I love to teach, but more for pleasure. I really like Steinbeck's East of Eden. I could see myself rereading that. I'm rereading Lord of the Rings right now. It had been a lot of time since I had read that, and it's still one of my favorite pieces of fiction. So I don't know if it depends on how you count books. I can't bring all of Lord of the Rings if that counts as 6 books in 3 volumes. But then again, Confessions is many books too, so I don't know.
All right. Well, no, those are awesome books to bring. And little known fact, I named my son Augustine. We call him Augustine after Saint Augustine. So
Nice.
I definitely love Augustine and his works.
Likewise.
And yeah, so why don't we start things out by just getting on the table, kind of clarifying terms and talking about different types of determinism and compatibilism. And specifically, we're working with causal, or what you call natural determinism.
Mhm.
And then we have natural compatibilism. And then we have theological determinism and theological compatibilism. So could you kind of talk us through those terms and kind of clarify what they mean and how they might be used?
Yeah, definitely. So we'll start with causal determinism. If you hear someone in philosophy say determinism, this is probably the kind of determinism they're talking about is causal or physical natural determinism. And the idea here is if the world is deterministic in this sense, then given the way that things were in the past and given the laws of nature, there's only one way that things can go from here. So think of like the laws of nature, if they're deterministic, as like a function, and think of some state of the world in the distant past as like an input into that function. If you plug in the state of the world in the past, the output of that function is going to be maybe either the next state of the world, or you could set it up so it tells you what's going to happen a long ways from now. But there's only one physically possible future. That's the rough idea with causal or physical determinism. And to say that that thesis, determinism, is compatible with free will and moral responsibility is just to say that there's some possible world that's deterministic in this sense where at least someone acts freely and is morally responsible for what they do. Now, there are lots of different versions of compatibilism, different theories about how exactly responsibility works, what sorts of situations people are free and responsible in, and there's some in-house debate, but they all agree as compatibilists that a world's being deterministic doesn't rule out freedom and responsibility. So that's the causal or natural determinism and the compatibilism about that. The theological variety of determinism and compatibilism substitutes thinking about just the laws of nature and the physical world for also thinking about God's role in things. And in particular, when we think about theological determinism, we think about God kind of determining things or making things happen. It's common for theologians and sometimes for philosophers to talk in terms of God's decrees. So the idea here is if theological determinism is true, then everything that happens according to the divine plan, according to God's decrees. So to kind of make it, roughly the same kind of formulation as we saw with natural determinism, theological determinism is the view that given the way God has decreed things, there's only one possible future, or there's only one way that things can unfold. And then the last term, theological compatibilism, just says divine or theological determinism doesn't rule out free will and moral responsibility. So even if God has decreed everything that will come to pass, it's still possible for agents to be free and morally responsible for what they do.
Thank you for that explanation. And
Yeah.
I wonder if you could also clarify, we were talking before the show as well,
Mhm.
that a lot of people come to the table with this inclination to believe that free will is incompatible. Free will and moral responsibility is incompatible with natural determinism. And compatibilism seems something of an, as you mentioned, non-starter, sort
Yeah.
of off the table from the get-go. And then you compound that with the fact that many Christian philosophers, like William Lane Craig, Richard Swinburne, and so on, they
Mhm.
all endorse and utilize a libertarian version of free will, and that version is incompatibilist.
Right.
And so a lot of people start maybe from a bias or predisposition against compatibilism. And then when they get into Christian philosophy, that's either reinforced or deepened. So I wonder if you could just say like just a few things by way of thinking that it's okay to be a compatibilist and or at least entertain the possibility.
Right. Yeah. There's some debate about whether like people in general tend to be libertarians or tend to be compatibilists, and some philosophers have tried to do surveys to kind of suss that out. But um, the way that people sometimes talk about the problem of freedom and determinism, sometimes as the problem of freedom versus determinism, it sometimes builds in uh, the position that we call incompatibilism, which is just that free will and determinism are not compatible with each other. So if you're thinking of the problem of freedom and determinism as are we free or is determinism true? It can't be both. Then you're sort of, regarding a compatibilist picture as a non-starter. Now, I don't think a lot of people, I mean, I think that's pretty common. And unfortunately, sometimes I hear, students coming to a philosophy class talking that way. But so I don't know exactly how widespread it is. But if someone is thinking that way, then they're not going to see what compatibilism even is. In fact, sometimes I'll have this experience where I explain that compatibilism is just the position that freedom and determinism are compatible, and some people regard that as like as a very interesting and novel thing, thesis. Anyway, I think if someone's coming to the free will debate assuming incompatibilism, they're going to miss a lot of what's gone on in the debate and a lot of the interesting issues. I mean, one of the main questions, if not the main question in the free will debate, is just about whether freedom and determinism are compatible. So I don't think of it as a problem about figuring out whether determinism is true or whether we have free will. Even though those might be interesting questions, I do think we have free will. But I'm also interested in this question of how should we think of the nature of free will? Is it compatible with determinism or not? And yes, if you're a Christian, you might be tempted to think compatibilism's either off the table for you, or you have extra reason to go for the libertarian alternative. I think a lot of Christians, like the ones you mentioned, Swinburne and Craig, are motivated by um, the worry that's sometimes called the problem of evil. The idea is how could a God that's perfectly good, perfectly powerful, and perfectly knowing allow the kind of evil and suffering that we see in the world? And one popular family of responses to that kind of problem appeals to free will, and in particular to a libertarian conception of free will, an incompatibilist notion of free will, where God couldn't have created us with free will and guaranteed from the start that we all use that free will to always choose the good. There's some value in allowing us to have the kind of freedom that doesn't settle in advance, that we won't do bad things and bring about suffering. Most, attempts to respond to the problem of evil go beyond that, because there's a lot of suffering that doesn't seem like it depends on, people's misusing their free will. But it's also a sort of central component to a lot of Christians and other theists thinking about free will. So I think that is one reason to be suspicious of compatibilism if you are a Christian, because it's like, well, if compatibilism is true, it seems like God could have set everything up so that everyone had free will, this valuable thing, and yet also we always used it for the good. There's some debate about that. I actually enter into that a little bit in the chapter that we're talking about. But I think even if that is a kind of initial, pro tanto reason to reject compatibilism, if you're a theist, a Christian in particular, it's not the only consideration to keep in mind. A lot of Christians have also wondered about how our agency, including our free and responsible agency, could coexist with God being the author and the cause of the universe, and the one who's in control, sovereign over what happens. And in the history of Christianity, there have been a lot of people who, even if it's hard to sort them into these camps that we use to sort contemporary philosophers, compatibilist, libertarian, a lot of them say things that sound very compatibilist, like that God is the primary cause of everything, everything that happens according to God's plan. God ordains whatsoever comes to pass, these sorts of things. And it seems easier to make sense of those things if you buy into a deterministic picture, or at least this idea that God's decrees settle how things will happen. He's in control in that sense. And so if you have that model of, say, divine providence, then it looks like, as long as you want to say people are accountable for what they do, you're committed to a kind of theological compatibilist picture. So I think there's some motivation that some philosophers either, that they're ignoring, or maybe they don't take it as seriously as this worry about the problem of evil. But there are some motivations, philosophical and theological ones, for kind of compatibilist position, even within the Christian framework.
Great. That was very helpful. And
Mhm.
I just want to underscore the one of the first things you mentioned, which is if you aren't open to compatibilism, or don't allow it to be a live possibility, you're going to miss a lot of what has gone on in the free will debate in the
Yeah.
philosophical literature. And when you look at it like John Martin Fisher and Revisa's semi-compatibilism is a
Mhm.
fascinating view, very detailed and worked out. And then that's just one little sliver of compatibilist options.
Right.
It's just this giant array of different possibilities. So I definitely recommend that you stay open to it. And even if you're a Christian, for the reasons that Dr. Sear mentioned, and then also just because you can deepen your knowledge of philosophy and bring that to bear on your philosophical theology if you stay open to compatibilism and really explore it.
Mhm.
Now, if you could kind of get on the table for us, what you're going to talk about in this article that you wrote,
Mhm.
if I understand correctly, you're going to argue for a combination of views where natural compatibilism and theological compatibilism align, or one
Mhm.
entails the other. And then what you're going to argue against is the view that it would combine natural or causal compatibilism with theological incompatibilism.
Right.
So that on that view, maybe you could just explain that view, and then also if you could just mention some of the other options like natural incompatibilism with theological compatibilism, and then when you go an incompatibilist about both. So we're not
Mhm.
going to explore those in depth, but it might be good just to kind of touch on those. And if you know anyone who's defended those, or what those might look like, that'd be
Right.
great.
Yeah. So the thesis of my chapter, this is very common in philosophy. You pick a very, very narrow claim and then try to defend it as best as you can. It's really just the conditional claim that if you're a compatibilist about natural determinism and freedom and responsibility, then you should also be a theological compatibilist. So a compatibilist about God's setting things up in the deterministic way, and are still the possibility that we're still free and responsible. So there are a handful of people who accept natural compatibilism. In fact, that natural compatibilism is the majority position among philosophers. If you look only at Christian philosophers, that the matter is different. But in terms of just like polling philosophers in general, most say they're compatibilists of one variety or another. So that's a pretty wide swath of folks who have given the issue some thought. But among those, not all are theological compatibilists. Some would say, well, the laws of nature being deterministic are one thing, but God decreeing things, that's another. That would maybe undermine freedom and responsibility. And so the point of my chapter is to say, well, if you're one kind of compatibilist, the kind that's compatibilist about natural determinism and responsibility, you should also be this other kind of compatibilist, a theological one. So yeah, the other views that I don't really wrestle with in this paper would be um, the person who's a natural incompatibilist, but somehow also a theological compatibilist. So yeah, the world being causally deterministic would take away free will, but God decreeing everything wouldn't take away free will. There are some people who think you can't have that kind of view because in order for God to decree things, he'd have to causally determine everything that happens. Um, I'm not sure about that. The view that comes to mind that seems to fit that category the best would be Matthew's Grant in his book on it might be called free will and divine universal causality. I might be blanking on I might be getting the details of the title wrong, but it's a view where God is determining everything because he's the ultimate cause, primary cause of everything that happens. He sort of does this in a Thomistic framework, but also he's a natural incompatibilist. So he thinks if causal determinism is true, that would take away our free will. People like me who are compatibilists of both types will sometimes criticize that kind of view for the commitment to natural incompatibilism. There are other natural incompatibilists who are also theological incompatibilists who criticize that view from the other side. So it's not clear to me that view is ultimately tenable, but that would be the kind of framework for that it would have to fit into. And then the last of the views would be I guess an incompatibilist of both types. That's a very common view. I think the people you mentioned, Craig and Swinburne, and a lot of other, Christian philosophers are libertarians, and they think even if they do think that God knows everything that's going to happen, they're not theological determinists. They don't think that God decrees everything that's going to happen, and they think if he did, that would undermine our freedom and responsibility. So even though God's in the picture and he, at least on some views, knows everything that's going to happen, it's not deterministic in either sense. And so I think that's a pretty common view.
Great. And I like that you narrowed the focus and your focus just on that compatibilism about both, being a compatibilist about both types. So that's helpful. Now, the way that you sort of go about it in the paper, you start out with a very famous argument, series of arguments or cases that sort of mimic the argument structure, which is known as the manipulation argument. And this is a I don't know if you call it fun. Yeah, we'll call it fun. It's a fun argument because
I think it's fun.
Yeah, I do too. And it's neat the way you step through it. And we'll do that. But before we do, let's go ahead and get the basic argument structure sort of on the table.
Yeah.
And I have it here. I'll put it on the screen if you want to talk through it.
Yeah. So usually when someone gives a version of the manipulation argument against compatibilism, they start with a case of manipulation and then try to argue from the manipulated agent's non-responsibility to incompatibilism as the conclusion. So you give a case where an agent is manipulated into doing something, and then the first premise is based on this case is the manipulated agent is not morally responsible for their action. And then, and this is maybe the trickier part, you try to argue that there's no relevant difference between being manipulated in the way that the manipulated agent is in the case, no relevant difference between that and just being determined by factors beyond your control. And so if there's no relevant difference, and if the manipulated agent is not responsible, then ordinary determined agents are not responsible. And so the conclusion is, ordinary agents in naturally deterministic worlds, that is, worlds with deterministic laws of nature, are not responsible for anything they do, which is to say that natural compatibilism is false or that natural incompatibilism is true. I don't know if it's helpful to go into any particular example of a manipulated agent. There are a couple of different main types of manipulation cases that get used in this argument. One kind of goes back to some of Dirk Pereboom's work. He gives a 4-case argument where he kind of argues from a really, really kind of like hands-on case of manipulation through a series of cases to just the last one being an ordinary deterministic world. And he says there's no relevant difference between any two of these cases. And so if you think the hands-on manipulation is undermining responsibility, so should a sort of manipulation-free deterministic world. The one that I think might be more interesting and helpful for this paper is due to Al Mealy. It's called the zygote argument, and it's a version of the manipulation argument that's based on this case where a goddess, Diana, wants for something to happen 30 years from now. And so she creates a zygote and implants it in this agent Mary, knowing, because she's in a deterministic universe, that this zygote is going to develop. Mary's going to name her kid Ernie. Ernie is going to grow up, and then 30 years from when Diana starts this process, Ernie's going to bring about the thing that Diana wants him to. And so in that case, a lot of people think, well, if Ernie has been sort of made to do this thing, bring about this event in 30 years, it looks like he's not free and responsible with respect to bringing about that event. And so, if he's not responsible, is there any difference between, Ernie having been set up in this way by Diana in this deterministic world and someone who's just like Ernie, but who is not created by a goddess in this way, who just comes about in the normal way? Sometimes people refer to this agent as Bernie, right? So Ernie's the one who was created by Diana. Bernie is someone who has the exact same life as Ernie, makes all the same decisions and choices, ends up doing the same thing, 30 years after his zygote is created. The only difference is he's not created by a goddess in order to bring about this event. Rather, he just comes about in the usual way. And so some people think, well, if there's no difference at any point in their lives between what Bernie and Ernie do, if either of them is responsible, they're both responsible. But clearly Ernie isn't, or so the idea goes. And so Bernie, because he's determined, he must not be responsible either. And so this is also, fits that schema that we were just looking at, concludes that compatibilism is false, or that natural incompatibilism is true.
Great. And then from that sort of case, there are a couple of different ways of responding. So there's what's called the hardline reply, and then there's what's called the softline reply. And specifically, let me put this back up on the screen. So if you could just talk us through what a hardline reply is in terms of how the compatibilist would respond to the manipulation argument,
Mm-hmm.
and then what a softline reply is and how the compatibilist would respond in that way with regard to the argument, because this is going to be really important for the rest of your paper.
Yeah, that's right. So the hardline reply accepts the second premise that there's no difference between being manipulated as the agent is in the case. In the case of Ernie, that's by being created by a goddess and for a specific purpose. No difference between that kind of manipulation and being an ordinary agent in a deterministic world. But the hardline reply just says, okay, actually Ernie is responsible, or whoever the manipulated agent is. Premise one is false. Turns out the manipulated agent is morally responsible for their action. And I guess this is called the hardline reply. That term got introduced by Michael McKenna. I guess it's hard in the sense that it's either, hard on agents who have been manipulated, or it involves biting a bullet insofar as it's intuitive that the manipulated agent is not morally responsible. But that's the idea behind the hardline reply. So we've got two premises in the argument, 1 and 2. The hardline reply denies that first one. By contrast, the softline reply denies the second premise. It tries to make sense of how determined agents can be free. The manipulated agent in this case is not free. And so softline replies involve spelling out some relevant difference between an ordinary determined agent and the agent in the particular manipulation case. And it might be that, you give a softline reply based on, one kind of manipulation case, and you give a hardline reply based on another kind of case. Because this is an argument schema and you can fill in different manipulation cases, it might be that that's justified. But a lot of people think no matter what the kind of manipulation is, assuming it's the kind that gets this intuition of non-responsibility going, that is, insofar as one, the first premise of this argument seems plausible, then there's got to be some difference between that agent and a non-manipulated but determined agent. And there are lots of different ways of trying to spell out what that difference could be. But what makes it a softline reply is it says there is some difference.
Great. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. And we can go ahead and focus a little bit more on that hardline reply. And in the paper, you mentioned that In fact, McKenna claims that really a hardline reply is sort of the only, or you're going to be pushed to sort of a hardline reply no matter what, or at some point
Right.
you'll come out with a hardline reply. And I believe that's what you're going to do as well. You're going to
Mhm.
go through and claim that softline replies don't work. And so you need to embrace a hardline reply. And then if you do that, then you're going to think you're going to be a compatibilist about natural determinism and freedom and responsibility. Then you might as well go the other route, or sort of it falls out of it that you're going to be a theological compatibilist as well.
Right.
So maybe what we could do is get one of the important quotes on the table that sort of you use, namely from Gary Watson.
Mhm.
He has this quote, and in fact, I've got the actual quote here. We could kind of talk through it. So I'll read it, and then if you want to add anything, there's two slides to it. We could just take one at a time. So as he says, quote, for the compatibilist, the constitutive conditions of free agency do not conceptually depend on their origins. In this sense, free and responsible agency is not a historical notion. Consequently, compatibilism is committed to the conceptual possibility that free and responsible agents and free and responsible exercises of their agency are products of superpowerful designers. For consider any compatibilist account of the conditions of free agency, and then I might as well just finish it here. It is possible for C to obtain in a causally deterministic world. Now, if that's possible, then it is possible that a super powerful being intentionally creates a C world by bringing about the relevant antecedent conditions in accordance with the relevant laws. This possibility follows from the general point that the conditions of responsibility do not necessarily depend upon their causal origins. So if you want to talk through that, I guess we could go back to the first there if you want to kind of just mention a few things about key terms or
Right.
sort of spell it out a little bit.
Yeah. I think I'm going to back up really quick and just say, as you said, McKenna, who introduces this distinction between hard and soft line replies and gives a defense of the hard line reply. He says, if you're a compatibilist, ultimately you kind of have to do that, at least for some cases of manipulation. And I think that's what Watson is getting at in this quote. It might be that, if, you sneak over and during the night you tinker with my brain and manipulate me so that tomorrow I have a whole new character, and I do all things I wouldn't have done otherwise tomorrow because you manipulated my brain in that way. Like I could say, well, that's not how it would work just in general in deterministic worlds. Like even if I satisfy some of the conditions on free and responsible action, like tomorrow I'd be doing what I most want to do, I'd be reasons responsive and these sorts of things. That might not be exactly what's going on in every case of someone acting in a deterministic world. And so I might be able to say, maybe I'm not free or not as free as, ordinary agents in deterministic worlds can be. But the idea here in this quote is if it's possible for a determined agent to be free and responsible, that is, there can be exercises of free agency in deterministic worlds, then however you spell out whatever those conditions for free and responsible agency, no matter how you spell those out, no matter what they are, it seems like you could have a super powerful designer, you could have a goddess, or you could have God create a world where agents are determined in exactly those ways. And really, that's what you see happening in the case of Diana. She's not creating the whole world, she's within the world herself, but she's creating this agent, Ernie, from a zygote with the plan that he'll do various things. But all the things that Ernie does throughout his life are sort of duplicated in the case of Agent Bernie, who is not created by a super powerful designer. He's just created in the usual way. So if Bernie is free and responsible, as compatibilists must say that he is, he's just a typical, ordinary agent in a deterministic world, then because he does everything for all the same reasons with the very same history as Ernie, with the one exception that that Ernie's zygote was created for this specific purpose. It looks like if Bernie's responsible, then so should Ernie be, right? If the things that make it such that Bernie is morally responsible are duplicated in Ernie's life, then he should be free and responsible too. I think that's the basic idea behind the Watson quote.
Great. And also, you mentioned in the paper that if we shift from a goddess type situation like Diana to actually the god of classical theism, let's say, then it looks like a case of theological determinism. And so you sort of say, quote, so natural compatibilists who take the hardline reply are committed to theological compatibilism as well. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So the idea is, okay, take a world where not only is natural determinism true, but God creates that world. He decrees that things happen in that world as they will. If the world's deterministic, all he's got to do really is decree that the world have deterministic laws and that it have an initial state. And then the rest is just going to fall out of the natural determinism that's there. But he could do this presumably by also intending, every event that happens. In either case, everything's going to be according to divine decree, and the definition of theological determinism that we gave earlier would be true in that thesis would be true in this world, because there's only one possible future given what God has decreed. So if you think you can take a hardline response to manipulation cases, then it's really just a quick short step that if agents like Ernie who are made by Diana are free and responsible just like Bernie is, well then all of us, if God has decreed everything that happens, all of us could be in that type of situation and could still be free and responsible if Ernie is. So if you're fine with taking the hardline reply, I think it really is a short step to theological compatibilism.
Now, I wonder if someone who wants to resist the entailment could, I'll just run this by you, see what you think, could invoke theological fatalism to draw a distinction between a Diana case, a goddess case, and then a God situation involving classical theism. So they might say Diana's foreknowledge is fallible. That's maybe part of what makes her a goddess and not a perfect being or a being of perfect being theology. And then you have God, on the other hand, whose foreknowledge is infallible. God infallibly foreknows the future, everything that's going to happen. And so they might try to drive a wedge between the two by saying that ultimately, even though it looks like a quick step from saying that someone's naturally causally determined and that's compatible with free will and moral responsibility, and then jumping to same thing being true of theological determinism, that you can be a compatibilist, they might say, well, all we need is that God's omniscience, a concept of omniscience that has his knowledge infallible. We need that the past is necessary, plus couldn't be otherwise, and then plus a transfer of necessity principle, and the problem's up and running. So were Bernie manipulated? Wait, who was manipulated?
Ernie? Ernie's the one.
Okay, Ernie
designed. Yeah.
Okay. So Ernie manipulated that. In that case, we can allow that a manipulation of that sort by a less than perfect being is conducive to free will and moral responsibility. But when it comes to a true sort of theological compatibilism, we can resist that because, again, God infallibly foreknowing the future seems to make it the case that our actions aren't free, and therefore we're not morally responsible for what we do.
Yeah, good. So I guess what I want to say is, if you're already a natural compatibilist, do you think we can be free and responsible even if, the past about the facts and, facts about the past and facts about the laws of nature sort of settle a unique future, or they entail propositions about everything about the future. If you're okay with, determinism and free will being compatible, probably whatever you think free will is also going to be compatible with infallible foreknowledge. So, like historically, there's been these at least two different threats to free will, understood in a certain way. One coming from causal determinism, and then one coming from divine foreknowledge. If God knows everything that's going to happen, how could we do otherwise than what God knows we're going to do? But interestingly, almost everyone who is a compatibilist about natural determinism and free will, whatever they say about how that compatibility works is going to carry over into the divine foreknowledge case. So they're almost always also compatibilists about divine foreknowledge and free will. So it's true that in the case, Diana might not have like exhaustive foreknowledge of everything that's going to happen. I guess she does consult her knowledge of the laws of the universe, of her deterministic universe, according to the original case from Mealy. And so she's able to like work out exactly what's going to happen to Ernie at every point when she makes the zygote. So she has infallible foreknowledge of some of the future, but she doesn't like look into everything. So she doesn't have exhaustive foreknowledge. But yeah, just adding in that maybe she looks at more of the facts about the laws and about the past, or her time slice, and she like now comes to have exhaustive foreknowledge. I don't think that any natural compatibilist is going to say, well, that makes a difference. Now she's taking away Ernie's freedom and responsibility. To say more, I think, would get us into like, well, what exactly is the challenge from divine foreknowledge or theological fatalism, and like, why is it that argument, depending on how you formulate it, like you'll have a reason to reject a premise if you're a compatibilist about determinism and free will. But I don't think that's especially controversial either. So I think, yeah, people would be once they're committed to compatibilism, I think they'll also not worry about divine foreknowledge.
No, that's really helpful, and why I raised that issue is because I've often read Al Mealy's case involving Diana and wondered, well, what kind of foreknowledge does she have?
Yeah.
And your claim is that she doesn't have you drew a distinction between exhaustive foreknowledge versus sort of enough foreknowledge to know about the laws of nature and the entire state of the universe at a particular time.
Right.
And as long as she,
yeah,
right, or just what would happen to Ernie, I guess. Yeah, she wouldn't know. Is that right? She wouldn't know the entire state of the universe.
That's a good question. I don't know if she could get all of the knowledge that she needs to have about what will happen in 30 years if she doesn't have knowledge that's pretty broad about the state of the world at the earlier time. I think Mealy might build it in that she knows the state of the universe and she knows the laws. So that's a lot of knowledge.
Okay, so to me that sounds exhaustive, and then right. And then also I would wonder if it is exhaustive in that way, then it seems like she's not a goddess. It seems like we're talking about God.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, of course, if she intends a murder or whatever, maybe she's not. Maybe she's not perfectly good or something like that. But at least in this respect, that's relevant. It seems like, and I've just always wondered what sort of foreknowledge she has. Yeah. So anyway, that's why I raised that case.
Yeah.
And
no, it's an interesting.
I don't know if there's. Now we can jump to some soft line replies, though, because people have gone that route and tried to draw a morally relevant difference between a manipulated agent on the one hand and a naturally causally determined agent on the other. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Kristen Demetrio, Robin Repko Waller has a take, and then Deary and Namias have a take. Do you mind maybe just working through just a few of those so people can see how people have tried to draw that morally relevant difference?
Yeah, I'll talk about Waller and Deary and Namias. They both focus on the Ernie case in particular. Waller says, well, look, here's the difference between Ernie's situation and an ordinary determined agent situation. Ernie, when he does the thing that he does, 30 years from Diana's involvement, he is doing what he does because of the effective intention of another agent, namely Diana. So her effectively intending, so not only intending that Ernie does this certain thing, but like being able to guarantee it, and it turns out that that intention's is effective. Um, that that the role that she plays in getting Ernie to do what he does, that undermines his freedom and responsibility. Or in some places, she talks about this at least mitigating his freedom and responsibility. But you wouldn't have that kind of mitigation of responsibility in an ordinary deterministic world where there's no divine agent effectively intending things. So that would be a kind of soft line reply. Deary and Namius's is slightly more complicated because they invoke this theory of causation that's sometimes called an interventionist theory of causation, where you have to kind of look to know whether, say an agent is the causal source of their behavior. You have to look at whether, the same result would have happened if you tinker with certain other variables. And without getting, too much in the weeds, the idea in this case would be that, like, is Ernie more the source of his action, and so is he responsible because he's the main source of it? Or is Diana more the source of his action given her role in things? And if you apply the theory of causation to this particular case, they argue it turns out that Diana is more the source of the behavior, and so she's actually more of the cause, and that's going to affect Ernie's responsibility. Again, it'll either be mitigated or eliminated. But that wouldn't happen in an ordinary deterministic world. So for Bernie, because there's no other agent who would sort of be in competition with Ernie for being the causal source of of bringing about this event. So if you apply the view of causation to this case, they think you find the relevant difference between manipulation of this kind and ordinary determinism.
Okay, now that sounds pretty plausible. I mean, I know you've got to accept a certain view of causation, but
yeah.
if you do endorse that, or you think it's possible, or you're willing to entertain it, then that seems like a great reply. So how do you respond to that, and then how does that relate to theological determinism? What's the connection there?
Yeah, so my worry for any kind of soft line reply, this is not specific to, it's not an objection about the theory of causation or about Waller's focus on effective intentions or anything like that. My worry is just that there's this other problem. If you're a compatibilist, you need to think that agents like us, who are finite and temporal, who came into existence, that there's a point at which we began to be morally responsible. And so think back to your own childhood, right? There was a time when you weren't acting yet, really. And then there was a time when you were doing some things, you were acting, but you didn't really know what you were doing or didn't have enough control over what you're doing to be responsible for it. But somehow between then and now, assuming that now you're a typical morally responsible agent, somehow responsibility entered the picture, right? Your career as a responsible agent got off the ground. And when you look at the earliest actions for which you would have been morally responsible, it turns out that there's no earlier stuff that you're responsible for that plays a role in making you responsible for that first thing. Just if you're thinking about this as here's all this stuff that leads up to being morally responsible, and then finally, now I am morally responsible. Even if you had some knowledge and some control earlier on, if you weren't morally responsible earlier, this is really the first thing you're morally responsible for, then I'm going to argue it doesn't matter what your history was like prior to that time. What matters is what you're like at the time of the action. So, compared to little kids, one of whom, snatches a toy from his sister. This is borrowing and tweaking another case from Al Mealy. And suppose that he's a little bit blameworthy for doing that. And now suppose that another little kid, and we should stipulate that for both of these kids, neither has been morally responsible for anything prior to this point, but somehow this is the sort of first action that they're morally responsible for. Now imagine a second kid who, has also never done anything that he's morally responsible for, just before he's in this same situation where he's tempted to snatch a toy from his sister, something happens. Either, someone tinkers with his brain, or he goes through the Bermuda Triangle or something. But he has this shift of character. So some of his values and his inclinations are altered, and he had no control over that. Now suppose that he's in the same situation. He snatches the toy from his sister. It looks like if the first kid is morally responsible, so is the second. Both of them acted from characters, values, desires over which they didn't have any morally, any sort of moral responsibility level control. They didn't bring it about that they had that character in a way that they're morally responsible for. And so it looks like if one's free and responsible, so is the other. But if that's true, and this is what I try to argue in some other work that I cite in this chapter, if that's true, then it looks like, moral responsibility is not essentially a matter of one's history. There are some compatibilists, including John Martin Fisher, my PhD supervisor, who think moral responsibility is essentially historical. Al Mealy has defended this as well. And if I'm right, then that's not quite right. It might be that like how responsible you are might depend on your history, but like this fact of whether the agent's responsible or not is all about what they're like at that time. So here, I'm drawing on some other work, but if that argument works, here's the implication for softline replies. There's going to be a basic problem in that you could have the same kind of cases that I've just described involving agents at the moment of their first morally responsible action. One where that it kind of comes about without the effective intentions or causal intervention by any other being, and the second where there is this other agent in the picture doing some kind of tinkering or manipulating. And on my view, there shouldn't be any difference between whether these two agents are morally responsible. And if you buy that argument, then the softline reply is it won't work. It won't be able to account for a difference between those cases. And once you see that, and this is, I think, in the spirit of the Watson quote that you read earlier, it looks like whether we're free and responsible and the conditions of our responsible agency just doesn't have anything to do with our history. And so that's why I think, reflecting on sort of moral responsibility and agents' histories can help with the, thinking through the details of the manipulation argument. I think it's going to preclude softline replies for those reasons.
Okay, now that I like. I'm trying to think of a potential response, and I'm wondering if you could say, in the case you mentioned with the two kids, if I was tracking correctly, the one kid has a sort of sudden due to tinkering or due to is it an endowment of some sort? They have a reversal of their values, so to speak, and now they're more selfish. So I was wondering if they may not have been responsible for that. It may just be bad luck, so to speak, that they got that tinkering done at that moment. But it does matter who they were T minus, let's say, 1 in order to see the relevant difference. And if you have a sudden reversal of personality, you might look down at the kid. I have 2 boys, and they have very different personalities. Now, if I woke up tomorrow and one of them, they switched personalities, I would say, number one, you guys are not morally responsible for anything. And second, what the heck happened? Who are you? So even though I would know who they were, because they're the odd couple, they're literally opposite on literally everything. I mean, literally everything. One loves sports and balls. One wants nothing to do with it and just wants to cook. And anyway, across the board, they're totally different. It's bizarre. Also hilarious. And I know you can relate. You have kids too, so probably you can relate. But so I would think even if they weren't morally responsible, let's say, prior to this one act, if they all of a sudden acted in a way that was totally different than who they were just the moment before that act, I think that would be freedom undermining. Or at least I wouldn't blame them for what they did. I'd sort of have mercy in that moment. I'd be like,
Right.
wow, this is really out of character for you. Whoa, what has happened here? So I wouldn't hold them blameworthy for snatching the toy.
Yeah.
And I might even think they didn't do it freely, because what the heck just happened?
Right. Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah, that makes it seem like a more typical kind of midlife manipulation case where someone has a radical reversal and then they do something that, yeah, is totally contrary to the character they had previous to the manipulation. Um, and a lot of people do have that response. Yeah, they're not responsible for what they do when they're, acting differently than they would have due to the manipulation. And in the other work that I'm referencing, I try to accommodate some of that intuitive response to those cases, while also saying that actually those agents who are manipulated, even in those radical ways, can be responsible for what they're doing, from their new character immediately after they're manipulated. And part of this is counterintuitive, but then I think I'm also trying to accommodate some intuitions too. So to me, it seems like you can say it's consistent with what I want to say, that these agents are morally responsible, that they're not nearly as responsible as if they had been morally responsible for their character. So, if you're two boys switch personalities and they do something they wouldn't have done, the day before, because of their new character, well, then I think it's possible that they're not nearly as morally responsible as if this, switch had never happened and they just went on doing other things. They could have been more morally responsible, provided that they've, had some role in shaping their character. They're partly morally responsible for that. Maybe they've sort of taken ownership of some of the things that they like, some of their values, that sort of thing. But in a case where someone, just by stipulation in the case, has had no say over their character, right? It seems to me like, well, they're at least not nearly as morally responsible as if they did have some control over their character. Now, here's why I think they have to be at least a little bit morally responsible. It goes back to the first actions that agents are morally responsible for. If moral responsibility is to get off the ground, so to speak, there has to be, an action that someone does freely and with moral responsibility when they weren't morally responsible for the character from which they acted. And so, if you think that that's possible, which if you're a compatibilist, I think you're committed to that. You have to think that moral responsibility gets off the ground. Then you're already committed to the possibility that we can be morally responsible for acting from characters that we didn't have any say over. And I just want to say that when someone's manipulated, that's exactly what's happening. They are acting from a character that they didn't have any control over. And, we have reason to think that they're not nearly as morally responsible as someone who had shaped their character and then done the thing that this manipulated agent did. They're more like little kids who are a little bit responsible, but don't have, the full normal amount of moral responsibility that we think typical adults do. So that's part of my take on, or my kind of critique of the soft line reply, is if you buy into this argument that tries to show that moral responsibility is not essentially historical, that it's really a structural issue, even if history can affect how responsible we are through this idea of character formation, well, then it's going to look like you can't really buy into a soft line reply, because applying that soft line reply to some of these cases, like, little kids, it's going to get the wrong result.
Okay, now this goes. Thank you for explaining that,
Yeah, no problem.
and also I'll perhaps follow up with you and get a couple of references to the things that you mentioned, in case people
Mhm.
want to go deeper in your work and kind of see how you do that in more detail.
Yeah, sounds great.
And right now, it'd be good to connect this to theological determinism, because you actually specifically argue that a divinely determined agent has no less control than a manipulated agent. So, first question is, are you drawing a distinction there between having free will, and that's an all or nothing sort of concept, and then the degree to which sort of you're morally responsible or blameworthy.
Hmm.
Because if I understood correctly, you were sort of saying that whether you had control over your character prior to the reversal can impact how morally responsible you are or not. Um, but you're still going to be morally responsible. And you're going to think if there was this first moment where moral responsibility got off the ground, then there was a time before that where you weren't morally responsible for your character, and yet you are now. And so you can act freely, but the shape of these cases may determine how morally responsible you are. So why I ask that is because are we working with a degreed notion of moral responsibility, but a sort of all or nothing, on or off binary notion of freedom, or are
Right.
you co-varying those? And why I ask is because someone might then sort of try to make a difference between causal or natural determinism and manipulation and say maybe there's a difference in control.
Hmm.
And you want to claim that there's the divinely determined agent has no less control than
Hmm.
the naturally determined agent.
Right. Yeah. So I tend to just follow the way that other people are using the term free will in the debate nowadays, where it's part of moral responsibility, right? It's like the whatever it is that we think, the kind of control that we think is required for moral responsibility. So I take freedom and responsibility to go together. I think that whether an agent is morally responsible or not is a sort of binary notion. But then I also think that that you can be morally responsible to various degrees. Sometimes people talk like, John Martin Fisher, for example, thinks that moral responsibility as a whole, that concept is a binary notion, but that praiseworthiness and blameworthiness, which are related but distinct concepts, those are scalar. And everything I say in this paper is consistent with that kind of view. But the idea is in these midlife cases of manipulation where someone that did shape their character a certain way, and then that character was tinkered with, right? And the agent who's being tinkered with didn't have any say in this. They now wake up with a new character over which they didn't have any control. I think they can still be morally responsible for acting from this new character, just like little kids can be morally responsible for acting from characters they don't have control over. It's just that the degree of responsibility or of praiseworthiness, blameworthiness is decreased, is mitigated. But what's interesting is all of those cases where I'm saying that's what's happening are cases of midlife manipulation or these reversals. And if we
Mhm.
go back to the Ernie case, we don't have any reversals, right? The only manipulation that happens in this case is initial design. He's created as a zygote in order to develop into this agent Ernie who's going to go and do this thing 30 years later. But at no point in the development of his character, his values, and his desires is there one of these radical reversals that would kind of take away his control over what he's doing. He looks like
Mhm.
any other, agent who develops like Bernie does. So the reason why I think this matters for theological determinism is take a deterministic world with Bernie in it, and you look at all the things that happens to him over the course of his life and all the things that he does, taking ownership of his endowment, his values and his character, maybe making adjustments here and there, and then acting from a character that he is on board with. You can have all of those exact same things sort of copied and pasted into a world that's been created and even decreed by God. And that's, again, this is, I think, the idea or the thought behind the Watson quote. If the conditions for responsibility, freedom and responsibility, are not essentially historical, then they could be, there could be agents who satisfy those conditions who were caused to exist by a divine being. So once you're okay with Bernie being free and responsible, I think an agent, maybe Ernie, but even if not Ernie, an agent that's like Ernie and Bernie, but who just exists in a divinely determined world, is going to have the same kind of control over what he does at every stage of his life.
Okay, and then connecting this back, so you're going to say that you can't draw a morally relevant difference between the cases there isn't a morally relevant difference that would allow you to say one's morally responsible and the other isn't.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
So
So you're blocking that soft line reply from drawing that distinction, right?
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. And then that connects back to theological determinism, because you want to say the divine decrees are determining everything, but they're not tinkering. So
Right.
this was
Yeah.
another question I had. So is it, and then I worry that we're talking almost about a deistic God, but I'm wondering, are we talking about a midlife case when it comes to God? Or are we talking about both cases where
Mm,
you have the initial decree and that sort of determines everything, but then God tinkers to make sure everything still goes according
right.
to divine decree? Does that make sense?
Yeah. That does make
I'm
sense.
just
Yeah.
trying to understand how this works.
Yeah. I don't think you have to be thinking deistically rather than theistically. I was imagining, even if God decrees that things are going to happen, this involves the creation of the world, but also the sustaining of the world, or causing it to exist at every moment that it exists. Um, so he's intimately involved at every time somehow. We don't need to get into that too much, but I wasn't thinking that amounted to tinkering, because I was using that word to involve some kind of like change or alteration to a person's values or character that they're not having any role in shaping. But on
Okay.
traditional theistic pictures, even if God is sort of sustaining the world, even continually creating it at every moment that it exists, there's still this, like, unless you're like an occasionalist like Malebranche or something, you're going to think there are following Thomas Aquinas, there are these secondary causes that involve our agency, and God's not interrupting, but rather is upholding the realm of, or the order of, secondary causes. So as long as you think that God's not like constantly, you know, making us act out of character or changing our characters against our will or something like that, you won't have the kind of midlife tinkering manipulation.
Okay, now thank you for explaining that. And then
Mhm.
what is the implication of this? So you talk about Turner's article, and namely he says that you can be a compatibilist and use the free will defense against the problem of evil, which is kind of
Mhm.
surprising because as we mentioned earlier, it seems like you have to be an incompatibilist to sort of
Right.
use the free will defense. But now you're saying that actually this shows that Turner's compatibilist free will defense doesn't work. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, and I think it's actually pretty straightforward if you think of what Turner's up to in his compatibilist free will defense paper. Basically, his idea is that, if you're a compatibilist, you just think that people can be free and responsible even if they're determined to act as they do. But it's consistent with compatibilism that you also accept a kind of soft line view. That's ultimately how I read his view. He has a certain thesis called independence, where you build into the compatibilist picture that people are free and responsible only when they're not sort of arranged by another agent to act in a certain way. And I see you've just put that here on the screen.
Yeah.
So the independence claim says if S's arranging matters in way W would result in T's being causally determined to A, and if S knows this and arranges matters in way W in order to get T to A, then T is not freely A. This is something like the kind of soft line replies that we looked at, where S is the like manipulating agent and T is the manipulated agent. And the idea is, well, even if ordinary deterministic agents can be free and responsible, according to independence, it can't be that they're set up to causally, to deterministically A by someone else who wants them to A, right? In order to get them, sets them up in order to get them to do that. But as we've already seen, I think there's a problem, a general problem for soft line replies that has to do with, moral responsibility being not essentially historical. And that's just to reject this independence claim. So if that's right, then even though I'm a compatibilist and I want a response to the problem of evil, I can't take the free will defense that Turner's arguing for.
Okay. That's a like an upshot of your view. And then you also mentioned that this sort of raises the cost. As you mentioned about Patrick Todd, he sort of has the intuition, and that a lot of people do, that, is it like, it just, there's something intuitive to the fact that Ernie got a bum rap.
Yeah.
Or in Paraboom's case, Plum got a bum rap. And like, just thinking that the goddess Diana or the neuroscientists that program Plum are just sort of irrelevant just seems to his moral desert, just seems still intuitively problematic. So
right.
if we go this route, it seems like we've increased the cost of compatibilism, or endorsing compatibilism, because we have to endorse this picture on which things really conflict with what we think intuitively is the case about these cases. And how do you respond to that, or sort of say, yeah, it may appear that this has raised the cost, but not really?
Yeah. Good. I think this is an important question, because although it can seem like, what matters in the debate between compatibilists and libertarians is, does the manipulation argument work? Does it undermine compatibilism? Or, does, say, the problem of luck or something like this undermine libertarianism? Probably there's not going to be any argument on either side that sort of decisively shows that the other position just isn't tenable, it can't be held. Probably, they're going to highlight different aspects of the view that some people will judge as more or less costly. Right? This view might have disadvantages. This view might have these advantages. And when we're in a position like that, where we have different theories that are in competition with each other, we have to look at kind of whole picture considerations. Like, does this one have more overall cost than this one? And so, even if you disagree with me on the manipulation argument, whether it undermines compatibilism or not, you might think, well, it still shows something about compatibilism that's unsavory, or that I don't want to accept. And you might have other views that make it kind of together with those considerations that make you a libertarian than a compatibilist. I think those kinds of things, those kinds of conversations are worth having. But before I even get to the things that I say in the paper about this, the thing that strikes me now, as we're saying, is that it could be that our intuitions about various manipulation cases, which this whole debate kind of rests on, it could be that they sometimes are they're picking up on noise, the other features of the situation that aren't about the agent's kind of blameworthiness. And in particular, when you've got some neuroscientists, like in Paraboom's case, getting Plum to kill someone, or I don't know. I don't think Mealy ever says what Ernie ends up doing 30 years after Diana creates him, but we can imagine it's some bad thing that he's blameworthy for.
Yeah.
In those cases, on the one hand, I want to say, depending on how you spell out the details exactly, there's some degree of blameworthiness by the manipulated agent. But also, these are cases where there's another agent involved and who brought something about through someone else. But it might be that they're involved in a way that gets them some responsibility too. And a lot of times when you have cases like that, people want to take a fixed amount of blame and then divide it among the agents that are involved. But I don't think that's quite how blameworthiness works. It's not like something that we have a fixed amount of and then need to distribute. It could be that Ernie and Bernie are just as blameworthy for what they do. And then in the world where Ernie does the thing, Diana's also somewhat responsible for it in a way that no one would be in the Bernie world. So I think another thing to keep in mind when judging the sort of costliness of the view, especially when the costs come from, intuitions, is, well, our intuitions, partly tracking something that's not the thing we're focusing on in the case. I might be wrong about this being one thing that our intuitions are tracking in this case, but it's something to keep an eye out for, I think.
Well, and that's
Yeah.
really a really helpful point too, because you could just the flip side is praiseworthiness.
Hmm.
So you could test whether the intuitions are tracking a confounding factor and sort of getting us astray, perhaps by constructing a parallel case, but have it be that the agent performed a good act,
Right.
and then wondering if that somehow, you want to blame sort of maybe Diana or something like that, and then say that, like you said, it's a split. You're sort of doling out the responsibility to varying degrees.
Hmm.
But really, what you're saying is you can be each agent can sort of on their own be responsible fully to different degrees, and you don't have to divvy up
Yeah,
the
exactly.
responsibility. But I'm wondering if it was praise, maybe people would be less inclined to focus on Diana setting up Ernie so that 30 years later he donates to a worthy charity, and that donation is the thing that helps them get over the hump and install a clean water pump in a developing nation or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And maybe you want to, those I believe those sort of things have been done by experimental philosophy. And
Hmm.
there you might wonder if there's a asymmetry between praise and blame. And I know this is sort of a separate issue, but
Hmm.
it might suss out or tease out whether our intuitions are going astray when it comes to blameworthiness. And perhaps the same thing wouldn't be the case were it to be almost identical, but we're talking about a praiseworthy action.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And it might be that there are some important differences between praise and blame that would explain the asymmetry. But I think, yeah, that it's good that people are already thinking along those lines. Maybe there's some good experimental philosophy on this, but it's worth keeping in mind probably more than I do, more than I keep it in mind. I
Okay.
guess, yeah. Do you want me to
Yeah,
say
go ahead.
anything more
Sorry.
about No, you're good. The thing I mentioned in the paper, and partly this is kind of building on other hard compatibilist work, but I guess I think, does it really increase the cost of compatibilism? They have to say that some, manipulated agents are morally responsible in the way that I say that. Um, well, it depends. Are there other cases that are pretty similar where, we treat agents as responsible, even though they're something like manipulated? And I've cited this in a bunch of my papers, and McKenna cites it in his hardline reply paper. But Nomi Arpali talks about real life manipulation cases, like becoming a parent or having a religious conversion, where you have the kind of value shifts that the neuroscientists and other manipulators in the manipulation literature kind of bring about in their victims. And when someone becomes a parent and then acts from a new set of values, we don't treat them as like, oh, you're not morally responsible. You didn't take ownership of these values. You didn't shape yourself into this kind of person. And similarly with religious conversions and other conversions. So if it's intuitive that you can have those huge shifts and it's something like manipulation, though in those cases without it being designed by another agent, then that might be some support for the idea that it's not really that costly or counterintuitive to take my line. The other thing that I mentioned, and this is based on some of my other papers, is it really that costly to accept the hardline response and be a compatibilist who admits that manipulated agents are can be morally responsible for what they're manipulated to do? Well, I think it might depend on kind of what views we're looking at when we make that sort of costliness assessment. I actually have argued that even if you're a libertarian, and even if you think there's some indeterminacy required for free and responsible agency, it can still be that manipulation takes place in indeterministic contexts. Other people have suggested that too, but I've also tried to design manipulation cases that kind of parallel the Diana and Ernie case, but where Ernie, the manipulated agent, satisfies typical libertarian conditions on freedom and responsibility. It looks a little different. Diana can't determine Ernie
And
to act the way she
does she
wants.
flip a coin, or does she push a random generator? Or?
Yeah, in one version, the one in my more recent paper, like she makes it so that either he's going to do the thing that she wants him to do, or he's basically going to die. Like there's only really one path forward into the future for him, and it's the way that Diana wants him to act. But she leaves, libertarian freedom in the picture and makes it so that it's not guaranteed to happen because she's not determining him, but it turns out that he acts according to her plan. He's under her thumb, so to speak. Not everyone's convinced by that case. But anyway, if there are, indeterministic variants, parallel cases that of manipulation that happen in indeterministic contexts, it might be that this is a more general problem for views that say we're free and responsible, not for compatibilists in particular. And again, if we're looking at if we're looking at like whole theories and comparing them, then whether this is a cost for compatibilism is going to depend on what we're comparing it to. If the best alternative is another view that has the same cost, then this isn't going to be a decisive, problem for compatibilists.
Right. And you might say that it's not as costly for one of the views as opposed to the other.
Yes,
because there's an easier response, perhaps, if you're if you're libertarian, or an easier way to sort of get out of these cases. But you're right. Still, you're going to have to face the same things, and at least in that respect, you're both sort of. It's no longer you pitting each other against each other on this one evaluative point. It's now, hey, we both got to face this, and maybe one view is a little bit better than others in addressing this issue, but we're both incurring costs. So that sounds reasonable. Great. Now, is there anything you want to wrap up? We're going to, like, any bottom line you want to bring this back to? And then I have a question for budding Christian philosophers for you, just some tips and hacks.
Yeah, I guess, kind of to sum up, I mean, I think, again, we've gotten into the weeds. That's how it goes with philosophy papers and book chapters. But I do see myself here as really just defending a pretty narrow claim, which is it's targeted at typical compatibilists who are worried about manipulation. And the idea is, once you see how I think what is the best way to respond to manipulation, it'll turn out that God setting things up to happen as he wants them to happen isn't going to be any more of a threat to freedom and responsibility than ordinary, natural determinism. So I don't know who exactly is among my target audience there. There's probably a handful of soft line, compatibilists out there who are sort of the target. But even if you are a convinced libertarian, you might accept the conditional that I'm arguing for here, which is if you were a compatibilist, then you should be a theological compatibilist in particular.
Yeah, and just accepting the conditional for the average person who may be watching or listening to the podcast, that might at least, again, sort of open their mind to the possibility of compatibilism not being ruled out, given that they're a theist.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to something that we said sort of at the beginning, a lot of people, due to the way the literature's unfolded and various voices that have embraced libertarianism and then used it to great effect, it seems like that's the only alternative. But if you're going to be a natural compatibilist, as Dr. CYR'S argued, then there's, given the things he said, at least a plausible case to make for being a theological compatibilist, being a theological compatibilist as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. Okay. And then last question. So what would you recommend for people who are reading philosophy of religion, and enjoy it and want to sort of level up or go deeper? What sort of tips do you have, maybe based on your observation of students or just in your own personal study, that would just a couple of things that might be things that they could employ or take on as tools or ideas?
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything special about my answer to this, but I think reading widely is always a good idea. So a lot of budding Christian philosophers have read a handful of like contemporary philosophers who are Christians and who have kind of inspired them. And that was kind of my experience too. Read some philosophy, including some by Christian philosophers, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. I like this way of thinking, and like the ideas, and engaging in arguments. But to go deeper and to understand kind of what's going on in the conversation as it's happening today in philosophy, or even in theology and in apologetics, like you've got to have a bit more background in the sort of philosophical tradition that's in the background. So it's not a bad idea to go and read Augustine. That was a helpful starting point for me. But even to dig into Augustine, you've probably got to read some Greek philosophy too. And so I would say, keep reading the stuff that interests you, that people are writing today, especially by Christian philosophers that are writing for a wider audience, but read widely too. And the more you can read, older books and voices, even outside of your tradition, the more you're going to be able to understand your own views better, and also see where other people are coming from. And I think as those are helpful things to bring to, doing philosophy as a Christian.
Great. And yeah, just to wrap up, I have a free guide on 5 arguments for God's existence, where it's just a quick guide. So if you just want to get the argument, the premises, and some of the objections and how to respond to them, you can get that at thephilosophical.christian.com/5 So go check that out, that free resource. That'd be helpful. Dr. CYR'S given a couple great tips as well for reading widely. And then also, how would they reach out to you, or go deeper at least on your philosophy, and where should they go to learn more about you and read more of your work?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I have a website. It's taylorwcyr.com. So TAYLORW and then CYR.com. And I think it's up to date. I have a list of publications there, and a lot of links to interviews like this, and then my own podcast that I do with my friend Matt Flummer, The Free Will Show, where we interview mostly other philosophers, sometimes scientists, but about issues related to free will. If the links to my papers on my website go to things that are behind a paywall, people can find them on academia.edu or Phil Papers. But if there's anything you want to reach out about, or any paper that you'd like a copy of, you can also email me, reach out to me directly. There's contact info on the website too.
Great. Well, thank you again for being on the Coffee with Philosophers podcast. Again, go check out his podcast. Excellent podcast. Very, very specific to free will. And so there's just so much great information. He interviews super fascinating guests, and his co-host is Matthew Flummer. So go check that out. And again, thank you for being on the podcast, and I look forward to connecting again in the future.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.